episode 5 of Amplified Marriage. Today we are talking about boundaries, physical boundaries. Welcome to another episode of Amplified Marriage. My name is Brian.
My name's Natalie.
So glad that you could join us. For this episode, we are going to be having another conversation about boundaries.
That's right. Physical boundaries.
Physical boundaries. And Henry Cloud actually had a really great quote regarding just being married. But I said, and intimacy. And we're talking about the emotional boundaries and the physical boundaries. The quote is, true intimacy is only built around the freedom to disagree. Mm-hmm. And sometimes with the boundaries that we've been talking about in the last episode and that we're going to be talking about in this one, sometimes they may seem like they're a little bit rigid or they're a little bit too harsh or they're for the other person, not really for you. And so we want to address some of those things. Because really what we want to be able to do is offer you information and ways and stories and things that can actually help you engage in your own relationship and actually be brought to a healthy place of intimacy.
Right. And everything obviously stems around that foundation of communication.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, there's plenty of the things that we're going to talk about today that, you know, that pertain to our marriage, but maybe you find yourself in the same situation with your spouse. But the misconception I think about communication is that it's the end goal is just that you have to agree with me. And I think we thought that for a long time.
You mean the end goal on boundaries?
On just boundaries and just communicating them in a healthy way was that you had to absolutely agree with everything that I said. And the whole point was to come to an understanding. It's not to like beat you over the head so that you absolutely agree with everything that I'm saying.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
And early on in the relationship, I think it probably felt like when you were telling me about these boundaries or things that we needed to deal with, that it was more about you wanting to change me.
Or control you, yeah.
Or control me. And I am very horribly controlled. I do not appreciate it when people try and control me. That's actually one of my biggest fears. I'm an 8. I'm a challenger on the Enneagram, and I really hate being controlled. And so I think early on in our marriage, I actually felt like every time we had to have a hard chat, it was always about me doing something wrong, and you wanted to control me or to change me.
Yeah, your defenses were up for sure.
Immediately. So. And we'll get into that, but I think tone had a lot to do with it and when you approached me. But,
so when you're sitting down and having a conversation about boundaries, emotional boundaries, physical boundaries, whatever it might be, it's to come to a mutual understanding.
Yeah.
It's not to say this is absolutely how it's going to be, and rigid, like you had said in the opening. Yeah,
and so there's some common misconceptions about boundaries that we just wanted to address first. And so some of those is that they're often misunderstood or misread. Just even like what we talked about is I know Natalie's heart, even though maybe what I thought about her, even at the times of these conversations, may have been laced with a little bit of frustration or anger, and that sometimes changes your perception of your partner,
right?
And how you're going to behave. And so
I think the approach too caused a lot of confusion and didn't really help in you understanding,
right,
where I was coming from, and vice versa.
And the fact that we were young and we didn't really learn how to communicate properly until quite a bit later in our relationship. But one of the things that and the misconceptions about boundaries is that people who set boundaries are sometimes labeled as selfish or rigid. Like I said, when she always set those boundaries, it always felt like it was on me, and it always felt like I was being painted into a box.
Right.
That I needed to behave this way, and if I was to step out of that box, there's going to be punishment. And so oftentimes boundaries these are misconceptions. The truth about boundaries is that it actually helps you and your spouse develop intimacy and trust and relationship building with each other.
That's right. And just from a different side note, if anyone, whether it's your spouse or an outside influence or an outside, friend or family member, whoever is saying, it's kind of selfish of you and whatever. I mean, that's not okay. Boundaries are not selfish. They're actually necessary.
And they're healthy.
They are healthy.
Boundaries are healthy.
Absolutely.
One of the other boundaries is that sometimes when you're laying the boundaries down, and this is where I felt a lot, is that I thought she was trying to control me.
Right.
And she's wanting to restrict my personality or my creativity or the way I handled things. She actually I really felt that that's what she was trying to do, is to control me. And maybe at the time you were. I don't know. Maybe you can address that. Were you trying to control me because I was out of control?
No, because I think we talked about some of these boundaries that we're going to get into today when we were dating. And I think we had a mutual understanding of when we were dating of how we should treat one another and how we should speak to one another. And we'll get there because actually talking about it when things are in that like honeymoon dating stage and actually being married and facing the reality of what our marriage looked like at the beginning. Yeah. I think we're two different, like it did a flip flop. It did a 180-degree change in my own heart of like, I felt like this was not the person I married, and all the things that we had talked about and how we would treat each other just went out the window. And for me, that did too. Yeah.
Another common misconception about a boundary is that you're essentially telling the spouse or your partner what to do and not to do. This is how it's like when you have children. If you don't teach them how you want them to behave in public, you can't dictate to them how you need them to behave in public when you get out in public.
Mm-hmm. So you can't expect them to know.
If I don't teach my kids how to behave properly, I can't expect that. If I don't have boundaries set for them, and if I didn't have boundaries for me and Natalie to be able to grow together, we would know that she's not trying to control what I'm doing or what I'm going to do or not going to do.
And it boils down to having those talks about the expectation, right? Yeah. If it's not clearly indicated or spoken what the expectation is, then you really can't get mad when it's not met.
Yeah, that's right. And just a couple little things. You, in a relationship, no matter what, in a marriage, a friendship, with your children, you cannot expect the other person to behave exactly the way that you want them to.
That's right.
If that's your expectation of the other person...
Oh, it's going to be a long road.
Oh, boy, you're going to be missing so many different things and so many opportunities for growth and maturity, even in your own life, because you're expecting someone else to meet your expectations on them. And we've talked about that, but that actually is frustrating for both people.
That's right. And it's devastating because then you resort to really, in my case, really petty manipulation tactics in order to get you to change and modify your behavior. When that's not the goal of setting boundaries. The goal of setting boundaries is so that you both have a healthy understanding of how we are going to deal with certain circumstances, how we're going to deal with outside influences, how we're going to deal with finances, how we're going to deal with how we speak to each other, how we're going to parent. These are healthy boundaries of what we're willing to allow, because you get what you tolerate.
Henry Cloud. Yeah. He is the master of the marriage quotes. One of the things, if you have been communicating your boundaries with each other and you're working from a place of a healthy relationship and you're working into that relationship with each other to be honest and open about those things, it actually helps you avoid conflict. Right? If you are communicating the boundaries and you're like, oh man, I missed that. And you have to be grace on both sides. It can't just be one-sided, like every time you miss or I miss what you asked me to do. Like, remember the garbage can situation?
Yeah.
You want to talk about the garbage can situation?
Well, no, because I feel like we covered that in the unmet expectations. And again, like we're talking today about the importance of communicating
the boundaries.
Those boundaries. And that wasn't a boundary. That wasn't like a make or break situation for me. I mean, it could have been.
Yeah.
In our early years.
Really, in our early years, anything could have been the catalyst that broke us apart.
Right.
So there's just a few things that we believe are few physical boundaries that we kind of put together talking about this today. And the first one is never assume your partner's feelings. I would oftentimes say, well, you have no right to be angry. It's like, this is not even an angry worthy moment. I think I said that 2 weeks ago or last week.
Yeah, that I think was your default. I don't understand why you're so upset about this.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't understand, except that it didn't matter how many times I explained it. You still didn't see my point because you're not in my head. Right. And so I think when it's important when you're setting up boundaries to not assume that you know what the other person is feeling or the reason behind the boundary.
Absolutely. Number 2, something that we established or tried to establish early on in a relationship was a clear line of how you handled the opposite sex.
Absolutely. I think we could camp on this for a little while. Because when we were dating, one, we talked about divorce sort of not being an option for us.
Right.
So right away you close that door. And the goal is to keep that door closed and not to allow an in for anything, a crack in our foundation of our marriage, to let anything else come and separate that put asunder that we talked about last time.
Yeah. And you want, like I think I wrote down, there has to be trust in your relationship because you've built trust, you built intimacy, you built that relationship, but you don't want to do anything that casts doubt in that trust.
That's right. And I value you.
Yeah. And I value you.
So I'm going to place a lot of emphasis and weight on the fact that I value you as my spouse.
Right.
I value you as a person. And so I'm not going to allow anything to come in and separate that. I value you as our children's father. And so whenever we're dealing with opposite sex, I'm not going around hugging a bunch of men.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And if there's someone that I know, like a guy friend of ours, and it's, Christmas or whatever, then it's a side hug and it's very intentional.
And it's the same thing for us. And some of you may look at this and be like, man, that's really extreme. I don't think you have the same, or maybe you don't think you have, I can't say that, but maybe you don't have the same agreement with us about the restrictions on a relationship, say when it comes to the opposite sex. I won't meet with even my really close friends' wives at a coffee shop.
No.
If I meet with a woman and I don't counsel women, I'm a pastor. I don't do pastoral counseling with just women. I always have a member of my female staff with me, or I have my wife come in for that meeting. I don't do that. We have safety glass on our windows, so at any time my pastor can look in and look, or my team can look in and see what's happening, where I'm sitting, where they're sitting. We put all these things. I don't even like giving rides to just females just in my vehicle.
No, we've that was talked about, and that's one of those physical boundaries that absolutely you need to talk about what is acceptable and what is not. And it's not that I'm
absolutely
being,
you're not.
The insecure wife and whatever. But
you've never come to me and be like, man, that really made me uncomfortable, because I've tried never to put you in that position. But some things I didn't understand. I was young. In some cases, I worked with recovering drug addicts when I was in Prince George years ago, and it was a house full of women. And so I was young, naive, didn't know. And so my pastor put restrictions on me. Don't go over there unless you talk to the lead in the house. Don't go into any of the rooms when you have to fix things. So there's restrictions always put in place to make sure that what does the Bible say is to abstain from the appearance of evil. I don't want God to think, like, for God to look down and be like, man, what are you doing? This is not sharp. Like, you're not doing this well. But I also don't want it for my wife. And the trick with this one is that my wife's not with me all the time.
No.
I have to live that life and follow those rules even when she's not there.
That's right.
And
which is so important to have
trust.
Trust, yes, but also those friends, like a great support system.
Absolutely.
And we have that, where we have people that are advocating for our marriage, and sometimes they might notice things that we don't necessarily we're not paying attention to, and then they'll speak into that.
Right.
So you need to surround yourself with people that are cheering for the success of your marriage.
And they're not just yes people, and not yes people as in they're cheering you on and saying, hey, yes, you can do this.
That's right.
But yes people in the fact that when you ask them or they see something, they're just going to be like, oh, well, he'll see it or he won't.
Yeah.
But they'll just tell you the truth. You need to be surrounded by the right people.
That's right. And I'm not in contact, especially on social media stuff, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but I don't have my ex-boyfriends on there. You don't have your ex-girlfriends on there. There's not this like, oh, I'm back in town situation. There's none of that. There was one time where a couple of my friends and I from high school years ago were meeting.
Yeah.
And one of my friends happens to be a young man. And I went into that. I texted you and I said, hey, it's this person with me and this person with me, with my girlfriend and this other fellow. But I gave you the courtesy to let you know I'm not alone.
Yeah.
We're sitting in a coffee shop full of public people. Like if anyone were to see me, and it's not to be paranoid or to be, where I'm whipped or you're whipped or anything like that. It's just on the basis that I value our relationship and I don't want anything to be misconstrued as something when it could have just been a simple communication with you going, hey, this is what's going on.
Yeah. And you may see like this is really extreme. Like this is a lot of, we want to be married for the long haul. I don't want anything to come in between that. And so we work really hard. And even moving on to the next one.
And we've seen
we've seen
what happens when you let your guard down of being so arrogant to think that can't happen to you.
Yeah.
It can. And so these are real important safeguards.
Absolutely. The next one is even really extreme. And a lot of people look at us like we're
crazy.
Because we do this. But we believe that in a relationship, access to all of your devices.
Yep.
And
so important.
We were talking about this. I mean, there is some things like if you're like a lawyer or you're in Army intelligence there's jobs out there where your wife doesn't need to see, like we have a really close friend of ours that he's an RCMP officer. And I don't know if he has two phones or not, but he gets the phone call. She's not going onto his phone looking up his work stuff.
No. You can't.
And she's not allowed. And so there's things that are in place for people.
That's
but
right.
What we're saying is that
and then if you're in that position where you've got, sensitive documents and things like that, you're still responsible.
Yeah.
And not allow that to be an outlet.
Yeah.
For you to reach out to other people, right?
Other people. And because of the nefariousness and the sinister behavior of the internet and how it is with Instagram and TikTok and all of these social media type things, Natalie has access to get into my phone. She has the passcode to get in. She has all of my email. My email address is on her phone and her email address is on my phone. She has access to my work email so she can see what's going on. Yeah. All of my Instagram accounts, all of my Facebook accounts. And again, you may look at this as extreme, but I want to be transparent and open and honest with her on all of those things. That's right. She can look at it and be like, okay, I trust him. And guys, let me, if I really wanted to find a way around it, I probably could.
That's
It's not that you can't. And that's not what we're saying, but we want to have an open, honest conversation about things that can happen on Instagram. So she can look at any time at what I'm doing. And that's something that we put in place along with how we handle the opposite sex.
And another thing, like we've got 3 children, 15, 13, and 10, who also are on our phones and things like that might scroll through Instagram. And so we are like, it's almost like it's not just my phone and your phone. I certainly wouldn't want to be looking stuff up.
Yeah, right.
That I shouldn't be looking up because.
And then have my 10-year-old.
And then have my children.
Yeah.
Right. That's just not anything that I want to put myself in that position.
Absolutely, and it's.
And like finances, I mean, we've had a joint account since we were teenagers.
Yeah. And
that's what works for us.
Yeah, that's what works for us. And
right. And so that might not be a financial boundary that you need to establish with your spouse. But I will say this. Generally in a relationship, there is a spender and there is a saver. In our relationship, I'm the saver and Brian's the spender. And so had it got to a point where he was just wantingly spending on all sorts of things, then I would have probably, and I would have said so, that I was setting up a separate account just because we can't be in this situation where the resources are being drained.
That's right.
And our bills aren't being paid.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but that's another sort of boundary that's communicated. It's not just me going behind your back.
That's right. The next one, and this will be the last of the boundaries, is that no physical abuse.
no abuse of any sort.
No verbal abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, any spiritual abuse, any kind of abuse is immediately how you break the trust, the intimacy, the love. We have seen too many times men and women that have been in abusive relationships that go back, and the relationship just gets more and more unhealthy unless they've sought out extreme help, professional help, and have actively gone the other direction and tried to change how they're going to do that. But we don't even really need to talk about this. There's no need for physical abuse, spiritual abuse,
verbal, mental, emotional,
anything, any kind of abuse in the relationship.
And if you're in that situation, my prayer is that you are able to find help.
Absolutely.
Because that's unacceptable on all levels. And just because someone isn't leaving bruises doesn't mean that their behavior is any more acceptable.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we've been talking about, we've said this a lot, there's a way to talk about boundaries. Mm-hmm. There's a way to communicate the boundaries. The way not to communicate the boundaries is to only have small chats once a day about nothing, and then when a big situation comes up that you have to face, you actually have no relationship, you have no intimacy, you've not built trust, you've not set boundaries in place for anything, and then it just becomes such a big, overwhelming situation, which is what we ended up facing about 10 years into marriage. We got faced with a few things that we had never even really talked about that should have been obvious to us early in the relationship, and there's a way to actually have those communications in the heat of the moment.
That's not the time.
It's not the time.
No, I think. And also, like, I know when we were younger, I mean, you're trying to think of like worst case scenarios. Yeah. And I don't think we did a very good job in our early years of dating just because we were young and immature and naive and what could possibly go wrong until years in. And we're like, oh, there's a whole other world of what could go wrong as far as communicating.
Yeah.
So I would encourage preemptively talking about things that you're like, well, how does that even pertain to like our current situation? It might not, but guaranteed it might come up at some point, right?
Right.
So
absolutely.
I don't think that there's any, I think it would have saved us a lot of time and frustration had we sat down and even thought to have those conversations about, what do you do when you have meddling family? Yeah. That's a physical boundary that you absolutely need to set.
100%.
In your marriage.
Yeah.
If you've got outside friends, I don't care who it is, that is meddling into your relationship and seeking to divide, then you need to set some healthy boundaries there.
That's right. And the way you communicate, don't be like yelling and being rude while you yell and getting personal. Be open, like just admit, hey, you know, I made a mistake. And sometimes that's really challenging, especially to your spouse because they know you so well. Right. But try your best to just be like, man, I'm open with this and I'm not going to yell. Like I'm a bit of a yeller. When I get frustrated and I get angry, I try and overwhelm with loudness. If that's the way to say it. And so there's a way, and I've learned over the years that she doesn't respond to that.
No.
And so I have to change my approach. And so, one thing you really have to be able to do, and these are the last three things that I really want to focus on the ways to communicate, is you have to be willing to have some hard conversations.
Oh yeah.
You got to stop complaining about your spouse to your friends, to your family, and actually go face your spouse, face your partner, face your girlfriend, face your fiance. But be willing to have a hard conversation, because that hard conversation that is maybe an insignificant thing 10 years from now, but because you faced it then, you actually pave the way for better relationship, for better intimacy, for better trust, for better boundaries later in the relationship.
That's right. And really being choosy as to who you sort of give that voice to about situations. Like, I know who I can go to that is not going to just take my side and start bashing you, but is going to call me out on my own behavior and my own tone of voice and my own things coming out of my mouth, because I'm responsible for that. Absolutely.
And you need to, and this is the next one, is you need to be responsible for yourself.
Absolutely.
You can't be responsible for them. You're responsible for how you respond, how you speak, how you talk, how you react to how they speak to you. But you want to make changes, you have to make changes in you.
That's right.
You can't force changes into them.
No, and I think doing things, and again, like how we said at the beginning of you resort to manipulation as a tactic.
Yep.
It doesn't work.
No.
We noticed a real significant change I noticed a real significant change in our marriage when I started to focus on the areas that I was at fault.
Right. And same thing, vice versa.
Yeah.
I noticed that our relationship was shifting and I was less frustrated with you because I was happier with myself, because
right.
I was actively working at like, that's a Bryan issue. That's not a Natalie problem. That's
right.
a me problem. That's not a you problem.
That's right. And that's being really comfortable to own it.
Yep.
What is my part in the problem? What is my part in the resolution? And having that honest conversation with myself.
Yeah.
I am not right.
Absolutely.
100% of the time.
And the next one is, and the last one is one of the most important. So you have to be willing to forgive your spouse. Mm-hmm. We have counseled couples in the past that they are unwilling to have the hard conversation. They think that they are, and they're dancing around the issue.
Yeah.
They're unwilling to work on themselves because the other isn't changing first.
Right.
And the relationship is getting worse and worse. And then they're unwilling to forgive each other's faults. They're not showing grace or mercy in the anger that they feel. One, because they're not having the right hard conversations, or they're not having them at all. They're just dancing around it. And so
that's right. And forgiveness is for you. Forgiveness is not for the other person, because, you know, I think you had said in one of our conversations that it's like drinking poison, expecting the other person to die. Right. That is what forgiveness is. If I'm holding on to something that you've done and you've asked. Now, let me just say first that if you're going through a difficult situation, an extramarital affair, things like that, it's going to be a long road. It's not, and you need help and you need counseling. So if you find yourself in that situation, it's not as easy as just saying, well, I'm sorry.
Oh boy.
Right. That's a whole different conversation. If you find yourself there, then please get help, seek out some counseling. But for, when we're setting up boundaries as far as like on our devices and people's influence outside of our marriage, and setting boundaries with meddling people and things like that, or how you speak to me, that's a physical boundary, right? That we established early on. If you happen to like misstep and speak to me in a nasty tone or whatever, and you're saying sorry, that's kind of the forgiveness that we're talking about. And yes, you can come to a place in an affair situation where you can come to that place of forgiveness. We've seen it.
Yeah. Seen it successfully.
Right. And so it's just it's going to be a long road.
Forgiveness is one of the most challenging parts of being married, is because that person can say the same things a week later and it still hurts, and
that's
you still
right.
you have to choose to forgive,
and so, it's a process. I mean, there's a reason why like the Bible says 70 times 7, that is a lot of forgiving that I'm going to be doing, but that doesn't mean that I'm not holding the behavior accountable. Right. That's so right. I'm not letting it eat away at my peace in my heart, and I might have to forgive you 400 times in one day about that one issue, right? Yeah. And it's a process. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Just as a recap, some of the boundaries that we have spoken tonight is never assume your partner's feelings. Clear line in the sand about how you deal with the opposite sex. We've seen that one go sideways way too often because there was no boundaries discussed. Yeah. We have a really firm belief and access to all of our devices to each other, and no physical abuse of any kind, mental, spiritual, emotional, any kind of abuse. No. Those are the ones that we spoke about tonight. And then we talked about ways to communicate, just being open, not yelling and being frustrated and talking personal. Yeah. Be willing to have a hard conversation. You have to work on yourself. You can't expect them to change. You got to change you, and you got to be willing to forgive. That's the end of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions or comments, or you have something you'd love for us to discuss on the podcast, please do not hesitate to reach out at amplifiedmarriage@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.